Hi, and welcome to our webinar on functional forecasting. This is being hosted by OFMA, and we have Jen Clemo from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon with us today. We've been working with her for a few years now, doing lots of workshops on different organizational development topics for your farmers market. We have several other videos and webinars with her on our YouTube channel. She's been really great. There's a lot of great tools and information she's shared with us that will help make things easier for your market to operate. These are great videos to share with your board members or for you to watch too. I'll put a link in the chat in a second so that you can see any of the ones that you've missed. But now I will just hand things over to Jen to take over. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I think it's going to stop sharing yours. And I'll flip over to my presentation here. Just make sure you guys can all see that okay?
Looks good.
Okay. I'll also be able to monitor the chat while I'm going along. So feel free to chime in the chat if you have anything to add. And I'm fairly well versed in also kind of monitoring raised hands and that kind of thing. So we're a pretty small group. I'm glad to keep this really conversational, hear from you all as we go through this. I'd love to hear about your experiences, thoughts, or questions. So I hope that you'll feel comfortable kind of chiming in as we go through this. As Amanda said, I'm Jen Clemo. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Leadership and Learning at the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. And we're talking today about taking control of your cash flow, specifically for small organizations. And I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for that, but also some tools. So I also like to remind people that you're going to get a copy of this recording, as Amanda said, a copy of the slides in PDF form, and then also an Excel spreadsheet that is the template for the cash flow projector that you guys will also have. So just note that for your reference so that you don't feel like you have to take copious notes. You can really follow along and engage. I also want to make sure that you are aware of some other upcoming learning opportunities from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. So I won't belabor this too much, but we've got some that I'd especially like to point out. So on July 25th, we have a session with Susan Bauer of the Department of Justice Charitable Activities section on understanding membership in nonprofits. We also have another Susan Bauer session on August 22nd around avoiding nonprofit fraud and embezzlement. The true crime lover in me just loves these fraud and embezzlement ones, but they're also just really good information for all nonprofits to have. Of course, some other things are mentioned here as well, but be on the lookout for lots of other learning opportunities from NAO. We are your state association serving nonprofits in the state of Oregon. And so I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have about how to engage with NAO or how to take part in any of these training opportunities. All right, to kind of kick off a lot of my sessions, if you've been to as many as Amanda has mentioned, I can't believe it's been so many and across so many years at this point. It feels like a blip. You'll probably know that I like to kick these off with a little nod to this guide to nonprofit board service in Oregon and a note about your legal duty. So I'm not a nonprofit attorney, but I have been doing nonprofit work and serving the sector for 17 years. And we like to refer you to this red book for all of the legal insights related to how an organization is to run in the state of Oregon. So I like to note that according to the Oregon Attorney General and the Department of Justice, ORA 65, the laws that guide nonprofits in the state of Oregon, the board is legally responsible for safeguarding the fiscal health of the organization and protecting its resources. And what this means is that the organization's board is responsible for making sure it is financially and fiscally healthy and strong, making sure that an appropriate amount of fundraising is happening to be able to meet the needs of the organization, making sure that the organization has proper financial controls and processes and protocols related to that, and that there's some oversight as well that helps protect the resources from things like embezzlement and fraud. So it's just important to note that this legal duty is a responsibility of the board of directors. So as we talk about cash flow and why it is important and kind of what is necessary for any nonprofit to take into consideration, I recognize that some of your organizations may not be 501c3s or like IRS designated nonprofits, but I hope these best practices will help you to identify some ways that you can be setting your organization up for success. It's important to note just some things related to the sector and nonprofits as opposed to for-profit companies. One is that the unpredictability of revenue streams is especially difficult for nonprofits. A lot of our organizations run on revenue streams that are very seasonal or sporadic or sometimes very out of our control. And so it's really important to keep an eye on just how unpredictable they are and to see where we might be able to kind of smooth out some of that unpredictability and some of that seasonality. Organizations often have a lack of reserve funds. It's important for your organization to try to build some kind of rainy day or reserve fund, but most organizations are not running with, reserves that would allow them to weather a long storm. A lot of organizations also experience restrictions on their funding. So if you get a grant, those grants, for example, often come with a lot of restrictions. You have to use the money, just as you said, in the grant application, and the award limits other uses of that. And so those restrictions that are not on for-profit revenue is another aspect that is difficult about the sector. A lot of nonprofits also have over-reliance on one or two sources. So a lot of organizations have one or two streams that are especially strong and consistent, and they really have a lot of reliance on those. And if one should dry up, then they're really in hot water. So those for, your markets might be things like, vendor fees that have been coming in the same every year. If you have a significant drop or decline in that, that might be especially challenging. Or just the fact that you have a lot of your financial health tied up into that particular revenue source. The diversification of that is really important. There are also a lot of misperceptions around what sustainability means for nonprofit organizations because nonprofits are so reliant on these charitable streams oftentimes. So a lot of organizations are reliant on donors or sponsors or grants, don't have a lot of earned revenue that they can amp up should one of these other more out of their hands contributed sources become problematic. So just the fact that nonprofits are unique and some of that uniqueness really just adds to a lot of pitfalls as it relates to how we have access to our revenue, how our revenue is earned or awarded, and our ability to control those revenue streams long term. So a lot of organizations then experience cash flow issues. And so a cash flow deficit is one of those issues, and that arises when the payments are due and the cash balance is too low to meet the obligations, right? We understand this in its simplest terms, that you've got a cash flow issue when you need to pay something and you don't have enough money in the bank to do that. Pretty straightforward. But what it's difficult to understand sometimes is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is running on an overall deficit for like a calendar year, for example. So it might be that your organization has periods of time throughout the year where you're having difficulty making ends meet. And that doesn't necessarily mean that when you reconcile everything at the end of the year, the organization isn't doing all right and right side up, it likely means that there are certain points in time where your cash flow has become more problematic because of that seasonality. You're really reliant maybe on a specific time of year when you have a lot of income, and then you have to really stretch it out during periods where income is, less consistent, for example. So we'll get into some of these a little bit more and talk about how to spot it and how to remedy it. But it's important just to note that this is kind of unique to nonprofits, and that it's important for the board to be monitoring and keeping an eye on. So the forecasting that we're going to be talking about, it really gives your organization time to look out across several months and explore options, to be able to spot those challenges and explore the options available to you to help mitigate that before you get there. So why else are we tracking cash flow in this way? It helps to monitor your budget to your actual. So as you are, approving a budget, hopefully your organization is looking ahead to approve a budget for a calendar year or fiscal year. You're monitoring against that. How are we actually doing to the budget? It can be difficult sometimes to monitor in like quarters or across even like certain months that may lead your organization to believe you're especially healthy. If you get like a big income boost that month, it can be harder sometimes to kind of see, okay, so how is this going to work long term? So this will help with that. You can better understand your fiscal health because, again, you're projecting outwards to see how trends are happening across several months. You're looking then for those opportunities and challenges. In the spreadsheet that we're going to look at, you'll be able to see where are our financial forecasts, identifying places where our income is really low a certain month or expenses are really high a certain month. Where are the problematic areas that we need to track and identify right now, so that we can then respond to that? We can respond to change. If we don't get this now, how will that impact us 6 months down the road, and so forth? So we'll get into some of that. How this works usually for an organization, a lot of organizations forecasting is really just done at one point in the year. They do it around budget time. You prepare the budget. It often includes a lot of best guesses about how the year is going to go. Oh, I think we're going to get, these kinds of grants or this kind of income from our vendors. Or you think, I want to budget for a 10% increase over last year in all vendor fees. Well, if that doesn't come through, it's impacted your budget for the whole year. So what are you doing in the meantime to work with the reality that you have now? And how are you monitoring that perspective increase? And how are you judging the current reality that you're experiencing? So the organization kind of does this pinball tilt and back and forth between, cash deficits and cash surpluses throughout the year. You get a big surplus when, you collect all your vendor fees, and then you have a lot of expenses during your busy season. And then you have a few lean months where maybe nothing is really coming in, but maybe you still have some expenses or supplies, or that's when you do some, staff development or other investments. So how can we kind of help mitigate that and smooth that out a little bit so it's not quite so jarring for your organization? In order to do the cash flow projection, so we're still just kind of setting the stage and creating the scaffolding for which we're going to build on this cash flow projection. And I think when we see the Excel spreadsheets, it's going to make a lot of sense. We'll spend a lot of time there. But one of the important things to note is that this is a cash basis. So if your organization is currently handling your accounts payable and accounts receivable on an accrual basis, which is most common for nonprofits, then this means tracking that cash basis separately, and doing that in addition to whatever it is that you're currently doing to track your financials. So accrual, for those of you that maybe aren't sure, like how are we tracking? What method are we using? Accrual is when your revenues and expenses are recorded at the time that they're earned and not necessarily at the time that the money leaves your account. For example, so if you receive an invoice, you might track that invoice as something that needs to be paid in your QuickBooks, for example, but the money hasn't left your account yet. You might even cut the check and send the check. And so your books would account for that, but they didn't get the check and they didn't cash the check yet, right? So it's not tracking how much money is actually in your account. It's tracking this kind of like short-term forecasting, and that leaves a little bit of gray area as it relates to the money that's actually in the bank, right? Whereas a cash basis recognizes the revenue when you receive the cash. So not when you send an invoice to them and say, pay me, when you actually get the cash in the bank. And then your expenses when they're paid. So again, when you cut that check and that check gets cashed and that money leaves your account, that's when you're tracking it on a cash basis, not when you receive the invoice saying that you owe on a bill. So it's going to take a different kind of approach than maybe some of you are used to. If you're currently using an accrual system, it would likely require you to be doing this in addition. I don't want you to feel like you need to overhaul your entire bookkeeping system. This is a tool. This is supposed to aid you in that financial responsibility aspect, not kind of supersede your entire accounting system. It's also important in this kind of setting the stage to think about who tracks cash flow for your organization and how are you going to manage this. So doing this on a consistent basis does take some investment of time and energy. When I was the executive director of a very small nonprofit, we did have difficulty making ends meet sometimes. And I was doing this cash flow ledger almost on a daily basis sometimes. So I would update it with whatever I know right now, whatever is true and accurate for our organization right away, so that I could monitor even the next like 60 days, right? 30 days sometimes when I was really concerned about something. So it does take a considerable bit of investment at times if things are really difficult. But in time, when I was able to get a better handle on our cash flow, I wasn't really worried so much about the 30 days anymore. I was looking 9 months out, 12 months out. And that's when you really start hitting your stride. But it's important to think about who's going to hold the responsibility for this. And maybe that person is the person who currently holds responsibility for a lot of your income. Maybe that person is the one who is currently making a lot of decisions about how money gets spent or money gets earned. So think about the best person within your organization to do that. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quick. Okay, I don't see anything new in there. Okay, so we talked a little bit about building the scaffolding and building out, some investments before you begin. You also really need to spend some time thinking about your goals and making sure that as an organization, you have some clarity about what it is that you're trying to achieve through this cash flow. For example, are we trying to make sure that we don't run into any deficits? Are we trying to build enough like of a profit margin every month that we can start a reserve? Like what are you trying to track for? Is it just to make sure that you don't hit any concerns or issues, you can mitigate anything like that? Or are you hoping for a certain level of achievement related to profit margins or things like that? Decide what categories you're going to use. So as we look into this, it'll make a little bit more sense. But I decided when I was using this as an ED that I was not going to track everything into like minutia, right? So I was not creating a line item for like every single line in my bank statement, I was kind of creating some groupings that helped make this more manageable. You should also determine like your comfort level and your threshold. So, for me, I was accounting down to the penny based on my bank statement. And I would encourage you to do something similar. But when it comes to projecting out, what is your threshold, right? So that bank statement is great for your actuals, but for your guesses, when you're projecting out, asking yourself, like, are we projecting based on some kind of like average from previous years? Are we projecting really conservatively? Are we, what is our comfort level with how it is that we're creating assumptions or projections? And then in order to make this work, you're going to need to collect some financial documents, some bank statements and financial actuals to help populate your document. Oh, I think I clicked the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so now let's jump into it. And I think, Amanda, a lot more questions will probably come up like when we see this and we start digging into this. But as she said, raise your hand or add something to chat if you do have questions. I'm glad to hear from you all. So let's look at this example. So this is a screenshot from that Excel spreadsheet. And this is the top half. This is the income half. So let's dig through some of this as it'll start making sense. So what you'll want to do is to figure out how much actual information you have that you can populate this with in advance. So for example, what you might have is 3 months of actual data, like bank statements, or 6 months or 9 months. The more that you have, the more accurate your projections are going to be, because you're going to have data to use to create those projections forward. But you're going to need some data in order to start with your actual numbers. So at the very least, 1 month is going to be important. So at the beginning of the month, you would start with your cash on hand in your bank account. So this is where I would put, and this is all sample data. This is not, my data or any particular organization's data. But you would put your cash at the start of the month in this top line, and then you would start tracking below all of the income. So this is the income half of the spreadsheet. And every time that you get final information, you can turn it green, and then you can reconcile that at the end of the month. And we'll take a look at that. And every month that I reconcile, I would move this black line. Can you see this cursor with the dot? Okay, I would move this black line over. So that is my like reconciled line, right? So when I said you need to think about the categories that you would use, your categories are these ones here for income, and you can customize these fully. But for example, you might have grants, and you might have a few major grants that you would track, and when you think they would come in. You might also lump in some small grantors. So when I was an ED and I had some like a lot of grant revenue, I would track a few major specific grants. I think I probably had 8 of them or so, but some small grants would come in, like 200 here or something like that. And I would just kind of lump this into small grantors, because I didn't want my spreadsheet to be like 100 rows, right? Under sponsorships, same thing. You might have a couple of major sponsors that you're tracking. You might also just lump in some smaller ones. Individual donations, you can track all of those together, or you can, divide those up if you want. What may be more applicable for your markets are some of these lower categories, like contract services. You might have some revenue that you get from something like that, or from your earned revenue, your vendor fees, product revenue, if you sell like tote bags or something like that, some kind of merch or products, you might have some revenue from that. But you're likely also going to have some kind of miscellaneous income. So for our organization, we had like bank account interest, and every once in a while it would crop up, and then I'd have to find a place to put it, because if it was on my bank statement, it had to fall into one of these categories, right? If it was money that came in, I had to put it in one of these categories. So what you would do is then every time that you have a bank statement, you would reconcile against that with all of your actual information. And then forward, you would project the things that you think will come in. So what you can do then is on the other side of this line, I used color coding for things that were projections. I used red for something that I wasn't so sure about. I don't know if this 5,500 will actually come in or not. I'm feeling like it's maybe 50-50. So I put it in my spreadsheet, but I marked it red so I don't get my heart set on it. These other things I was feeling pretty good about. These are like 80% or so. The individual donations might be an average of the donations from all the months I have prior to that. So I can confidently say it'll probably be something like this in the long run, but I don't know that it'll be that much per month, right? We're creating some comfort level around what are our thresholds for averaging, for guessing, for making assumptions. It'll be unique to your organization. But then if something were to come in, so say this is a current month, October 23, and say this $10 in product revenue were to come in, I would mark that green as it came in to let me know in this current month that that's now an actual, right? And then when I move it over, move this line over because I've reconciled a month, everything should be green because it needs now to be actual, right? So when you're doing this, you're not going to have these nice round numbers. These are going to be likely a bunch of like random numbers. So it'll be like 45 and 12 cents, 92 and 17 cents, or I don't know. It's not likely your donations will come in at 17 cents, but it's likely that these are not going to be the nice round numbers that they look like right now. And what's nice about this spreadsheet is at the bottom, all of the formulas, and at the top, actually, all of the formulas are already in here for you. So when you put all of this income in, it automatically totals your income here, and it adds it to your starting cash to let you know like what that amount is total. And then there's a second half of the spreadsheet, which is the bottom half, the expense half. Any questions so far though on the income half or kind of how we're setting up this spreadsheet? Okay, I don't see anything so far, but feel free to chime in if you do have questions. So in the bottom half of the spreadsheet, we're tracking our expenses, right? And that it should say expenses up here. I don't know why it says income. So the bottom half has all of your expenses and it has them by category again, right? So for me, in my comfort level, I was glad to track these in some groups and kind of lump them together. So for me, when I tracked like salaries and personnel, for example, I lumped those things together. The salaries, the taxes, the amount we pay in their benefits, all the stuff related to like employing those people was all in that category, right? And then I created a few other categories based on what made sense for us. So we had some professional services like a bookkeeper and a lawyer that we use, every so often if something came up. You might also have some programming. So maybe you have, program A, program B. These could be for your markets, something like your chef demos or maybe your SNAP or EBT matching. You'll want to find a place in there for those kinds of things, and you can kind of lump them together in a way that makes sense for you. You also will have likely some shared expenses. So things that are not unique to programs that are just like across your whole organization, like the space rent that you use. Maybe you have some tech costs for like your point of sale system or something like that. if you have any debt or credit card payments or anything, you might have that. You might also have some supplies that you just kind of use generally and are not associated with a specific program, but whatever kind of categories make sense for your organization. And then in miscellaneous, you can throw things in there that come up sometimes, like insurance, professional development, your filing fees for like your CT12 and things like that. But these are customizable. So what I would find is that I would have, a new line item that needs added every so often because there's something that I didn't think of that came up and it's unique to that month. And that's totally fine because as you can see, you don't have to put something in every box every month, right? It just is when it comes up. So it's okay to kind of start with what categories make sense for you and your organization and then add them or customize them as necessary. But we're doing kind of the same thing here that we did on the top, right? So we're putting in the actual information, reconciling against the bank account. And then forward of that, we are creating projections based on that information. So for example, this $2,798.05 is an average of the past several months, January through September, of these things. Now, is that going to be the same all the time? No. But for your comfort threshold, that might be okay to just average it out. Other things, you might have more clarity around them coming up at like certain times of the year. So for example, on the insurance line item, you can see it's due in May and then it's due again in June. It's this exact amount. Maybe you already signed a contract for that amount and you know it's going to be that amount. You should put it in when it happens, right? But the spreadsheet will do the same for you as it did above. It'll total your expenses here. And then on the end balance, it takes that income plus starting cash and it minuses the total expenses to give you your end balance. And so what's nice about this is you can watch this end balance change over time, right? So we can see that we started out with $41,961.47. And at the end, we have a negative number, $2,512.59. So what does that mean? That's negative $2,000, $2,500. Well, we can see that this did not grow, right? This end balance is trickling off over time until we reach this negative number. The expenses are kind of high right here in January, again in May. Some of these big things are coming into play there, like our space rent comes into play. Yep, okay, space rent again. We've got some heavy months, we've got some lighter months, but these are not a difference between a positive of 41,000, almost 42, and a negative of 2,500. So where is our problem, right? If we go back and look at total income, we can see that we've got some big amounts here, but this total income changes quite a bit. So our starting cash was pretty high, and then our total income starts really trickling off. So it might be the case that our income is really the problem, right? We're not earning enough income. $65 is all in this month here to sustain our organization. So this is where we can start revealing, projecting, mitigating, and all of that. And the spreadsheet does all of these formulas for you. What you need to do is put in your data, create some thresholds, customize your categories, and then start with your actuals so that you have data from which you can project. All right, I'm going to take another beat before we get into some of the other more philosophical financial health stuff.
If nobody has questions for you, Jen, I have a couple of questions for them that they may answer for us. A couple of things I'm curious about. I'm wondering if there's any categories that aren't on this sheet that maybe your market has that you're wondering where it would go, or just something different that's not here that maybe you want to bring up as an example? It might be helpful for other markets to think of when they're making these sheets too, so that they remember to put it in. And if not that, I'm also just sort of curious, like how far out in a cash flow do the markets here think they may be able to project? What is like 6 months, 9 months? So could you do a year and a half? Like how well do you know your income and expenses right now? See, Jan in the chat is saying that they are able to project for the year.
That's great.
And another category they have is live music. Maybe that might go under programming.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jen, I think maybe if you want to keep going, that would be good.
Sure. All right. So let's think a little bit about, how to kind of approach this forecasting and some other kind of financial health related things. So as I mentioned, you want to note each month's anticipated income and expenses and do that on the actual timing of those items. So I think one pitfall that a lot of organizations fall into is that they will just divide by 12. Sometimes that's fine. If your personnel expenses, for example, are basically the same every month, it's just the taxes are a little higher, a little lower, whatever, you can just average that out several months in advance. If though you only have, there's a huge portion of your staff, maybe you have a bunch of contract like employees just during market season or something like that, and so you have a bigger expense at a certain point of the year, you should include it then, because otherwise it'll throw off like when that problem actually hits your organization, right? We want to know when the tornado is going to touch base, like touch land, right? So just be really mindful of like how it is that you're creating these assumptions and these when you're using things like averages and when you're actually using actual timing. Your projection should be realistic and budget aligned. This is actuals, right? So the projections should also be relative to your actuals. What you don't want to do is create lofty goals that then really derail your projections. So if your goal is to see your earned revenue increase by 10% in the next 12 months, you should be really mindful about how that is a plan and how it is like a kind of a lofty goal that you're letting influence your projections, right? And monitoring like as you accomplish or like close a certain month, how are you reconciling also that intention and whether or not it's still reasonable for your organization. If you have donor restrictions, you'll want to be mindful of those, because one thing that this doesn't account for, that it totals like how much is in the bank right now, how much is going to be in the bank in a month. What that doesn't do is for some organizations that get like a grant that must be used for specific things, it does not account for your access to that money being limited by those restrictions. One thing that might be more applicable to the markets is something like your, I think it's that like SNAP or EBT, the token system, right? So you might have credits for the tokens that sit in your bank account, but that's restricted. It's supposed to be for paying on the token system, right? But that money sitting in your bank account might lead you to believe you're more financially healthy than you are, or you might have more access to your money than you really do. And so one of the decisions that you might make with restricted monies is to maybe even move it outside of the forecasting system. For a lot of organizations, I generally recommend that they create a separate bank account, because you can have like multiple checking accounts if you need to, where all of that is handled through that one account, and your general ledger is done through another account, so that it is not influencing your perception of how financially healthy you are. Because should you suddenly have to pay on that, would you be upside down now? A lot of organizations will get, like, for example, a 3-year grant, and they'll look at their financials and be like, oh, wow, we have so much money. Like, yeah, for that one program, but how are you going to pay staff next month? Because if you dip into that now, which you can do, you have to repay it later with a different stream of revenue, right? So it's important to know how much access and control you have for the money that is in there. And then every month that you have that bank statement, be reconciling your ledger. And you can even do that more often if you need to. So you can do that weekly, you can do that daily. There was a point in time where I was like opening the bank account every day and keeping an eye on what transactions were actually hitting the bank account that day, because, we had a big payment due or something like that. So keep an eye on that and make sure that you're staying on top of it, because it's a lot easier to maintain it. And it's a tool that is serving you well if you're maintaining it, versus, just looking at every 6 months or so. Don't let it collect dust. As you're analyzing your cash flow, there's some questions that you can be asking yourself. So these are some prompting questions to help with that discussion around your financial health and where your cash flow is going. So does your cash flow projection align with your budgeted figures? So this might tell you if your budget was maybe too lofty, for example. A lot of organizations will find that they put a lot of goals into their budget that were maybe not as rooted in reality as they could have been. And so their cash flow is projecting a reality that is much more conservative than their budget is. So it could be the case that maybe you need to rebudget. Maybe you need to, use this cash flow data then to kind of reproject and rebudget for the year. Is the net cash balance growing or declining? So that net cash balance over several months, are you keeping an eye on that? Is it growing or declining? And then does the organization need to make plans now to avoid some kind of catastrophic result? So that net cash balance reflecting a negative number, we don't want to deal with that the month before the negative number. We want to deal with that 6 months out, 9 months out, right? As soon as possible, we can watch how it's tapering off to become negative. And we want little changes over time that are going to be less jarring to our organization than trying to tackle it when it's like next month, right? So keeping an eye on that is important. And then, is there a rhythm or seasonality to your cash flow? Certainly for the markets there is, right? There's a busy season, and then there's a slower kind of dormant season that many of you are probably experiencing also. And so how does that seasonality impact your cash flow? And what are you doing on either end of that to either kind of plan for it or to smooth it out a little bit? Are there other ways that when you have a slower season, maybe that's when you really jump into other kinds of earned revenue, or maybe that's when you do your donor appeal, or you do, some other kind of strategy to help create another opportunity throughout the year where money is coming into the organization. So for my organization, like I said, when I was an ED, we did a big conference, and that one kind of capstone event for us was a lot of income and a lot of expenses all at the same time, but we earned enough to, support and kind of underpin some of our revenue for the rest of the year. And so it was important for us to kind of monitor that, because what would end up happening though, as it does with conferences, is that there are a lot of expenses up front, and then you earn the revenue kind of around conference time, and then you still are paying on your expenses. So for example, you have to put the deposit on the venue, the deposit on the catering. You have to, buy all the supplies and you have to do all of this. And then, so if you don't have enough money in like your checking account or reserves to pay all the upfront costs, that's going to be really challenging, right? Even though you're going to earn a bunch of money from all the registration revenue, like 3 months later, you have to make all these deposits 3 months before the money comes in. So how do you do that? So recognizing when you have seasonality or these kind of high highs or low lows and figuring out what those mitigating circumstances are on either end that you can do to kind of smooth that out is going to be really important. Does anyone have kind of an example of that for your market? An example of like how you're thinking about this when maybe it's not your busy season? Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like.
I would think that markets in the summer months, that's their high point for like vendor fees and things like that. And if they do maybe some other like individual donor fundraising, if they do something like at the end of the year, then maybe that's their high point with some individual donor fundraising for as far as income goes.
That makes sense. And that idea of like spending some of that December, January time doing some donor appeals and finding another way to bring in some income in that off season is really smart. Okay. So I also wanted to include for you all some other kind of key financial indicators. So, again, these are great questions that you can ask kind of at your board level or at a group level so that you're kind of sharing awareness and really starting to get people in the habit of talking about your financials and asking critical questions. Boards really get themselves in trouble when they just kind of rubber stamp. And so we want to make sure that we're being critical and analyzing the information that we have available to us. So what are your current sources of income? What are your largest expenses? Do your liabilities exceed your assets? How much is in your reserve fund and under what circumstances can it be used if you have one? Are there any significant revenue or expense items that weren't budgeted? What is your biggest financial risk? Again, you can kind of customize these as it makes sense to you, but I really like to encourage organizations to get in the habit of being critical and asking good questions about your financials, and just leaving space for that kind of review and reflection is really important. So what's really nice about this as a tool is that you can do scenario planning with it. So you can project out, like I recommended, several months by just kind of like moving that line and creating space for your reconciled actuals and your projections over a series of months. But you can also create another tab that is a copy of your working spreadsheet and use it for scenario planning. And I really encourage you to do this. So you can create multiple cash flow projections to plan for different kinds of outcomes. So say you were hoping to get that big grant, that $5,500, but you didn't think you would, you can delete that number and watch how everything changes. You can double that number and watch how everything changes. You can make that goal of creating or of like increasing earned revenue a few percent, every month. And you can see what happens if you just add $10 to every single month and then see how that changes things, so you can play with these different scenarios. Now, please make sure that you're creating a copy of that initial spreadsheet. I was very, very protective of my spreadsheet because once you've put all the work into getting it customized and you've got all of your data in there and it's all reconciled, you really don't want to play with it too much and like corrupt it or just like have bad data in there. created a copy of it. I also saved a copy to my desktop and emailed myself a copy every so often with the date and time, and just knowing like that I've got a version of this safe and secure somewhere. But using this scenario option really gives you a lot of opportunity to watch different goals grow and evolve over time, or see how different you know, changes that you might make to your income or your expenses, watch and see how it impacts the organization long term. There are some things that you can do to help your organization when you do kind of hit hot water. And so I like to spend a little bit of time looking at those things. And I'm hoping that we also will maybe spend a little bit of time at the end in the actual Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to try to save a few minutes for that as well. But let's talk about some of this kind of like financial strategies for when your organization may be experiencing certain challenges or even opportunities. So when you do experience a cash flow deficit, there are some things that you can do related to the timing of your money. So you can speed up your income a bit, sometimes by shortening contract terms or ramping up collection efforts. You can also offer some alternative payment options. So for example, one of the things that we did when we needed to bring in those that earned revenue a little faster is, rather than say like remit on this invoice 30 days or 60 days, it was like due upon receipt, right? Or you can say we require half up front, half at the end, or something like that. Something that helps with your collection efforts. If you notice that you have a lot of overdue invoices, tracking those down and kind of pestering people to pay on their invoices is going to be important. You can also offer, like I said, these alternative payment options. One of the things that we tried was like, if you pay up front, then you get a 10% discount. If you pay half and half, then no discount. Those kinds of things helped us quite a bit when we were a tiny organization in my past role, to be able to kind of make ends meet when things were tighter. You can also sometimes slow down payments on expenses. So you can negotiate some longer terms with your vendors. In this case, vendors, I mean to be like people that you pay for their services. So it could be those, chef demo people, or maybe your site rental people, or some equipment people, or something like that, not your market vendors. But you can negotiate some longer terms with them. You can say, hey, I know this invoice is due. Can I pay, half now, half later, or something like that? Can we create a payment plan? Something like that. Making those small payments versus that lump sum can sometimes be really helpful. You can also, yeah, go ahead.
Say, related to this about how to speed up income, one thing farmers markets may think about doing is increasing vendor fees, and knowing where to set your vendor fees is a huge philosophical debate of its own. And I just wanted to share with the markets that we are doing a whole workshop on that next month. And I'll put a link in the chat to that. So we thought that these two workshops went well together, showing you how to do a cash flow. And then if you do your cash flow and you realize you may need to increase your income a bit, you can join next month's workshop about how to increase vendor fees. So hope people can join us for that one too.
Awesome. Yeah, that does sound like a really nice pipeline of learning. Yeah, so as Amanda said, you can also influence the amounts, right? So not just the timing of those things and how they come in and out, but the amount of those things. So you can try to increase income by increasing your fundraising efforts or increasing your fees. You can expand programs that do generate revenue and maybe set aside or put on the back burner things that are not generating revenue. You can also sell surplus equipment or assets. There are some organizations that maybe sitting on some like inventory of some kind, and maybe it's time to get those out the door. Maybe it's time to really push the sale of those tote bags or those t-shirts or those stickers or what have you. So, trying to increase your income in several ways. You can also try to decrease expenses. So if you really are having trouble making ends meet, it might be the time to look at temporary cuts on your day-to-day expenses. Do we need those janitorial services? Is that something we could take in-house? Landscaping, a lot of organizations have, some sort of services that they can maybe put aside for a few months a year or something like that. Reducing personnel expenses is unfortunate, but sometimes what needs to happen, and scaling down programs, like I said, especially those that maybe are not earning you money or running currently on a deficit. Borrowing is also an option for many organizations. There are options related to like short-term loans. So, if your organization is experiencing something where you need to make a big investment now that hopefully will pay off, across the next year or a couple of years, a short-term loan might be a good option. Lines of credit can also sometimes be really helpful. So our organization took that route. Like I said, we had this conference and we had to prepay all of these things, but we didn't earn all the registration revenue until like right around conference time. So that line of credit allowed us to kind of dip into it when we needed to. And then we were not paying any interest on anything we didn't use. And we also weren't paying interest when we weren't using it. So we could dip in, pay it back, and then, had the opportunity to kind of work with that. We also had credit cards, those might be options for your organization as well. So, just things to consider, tools that are available to you if that's something that you need to use to mitigate some deficits or just kind of manage a situation in the shorter term. I like to remind people, though, that there are some things that you must pay on time and are really important. So if you are struggling to make ends meet, where you do not want to skimp, like I said, put aside landscaping, take off, like you might not get live music for a couple of months or, whatever it is that for your organization makes sense. What you must do, though, is pay your payroll taxes, and pay your insurance. And the first two are especially important because like you're going to get in legal hot water if you don't do these things. But there are a lot of protections for board members of nonprofit organizations against like negligence and things like that. You can get directors and officers insurance. There are also a lot of protections built in because you're volunteers of this organization. Where those protections don't actually protect you is when it comes to payroll taxes. The IRS has come after board members as individuals, like their own personal financials, when payroll taxes are not paid for an organization. So pay your payroll taxes, pay your staff, and then keep your insurance up to date because should something happen, you don't want that to happen when you've lapsed in your insurance, right? So be mindful about the things that you can maybe put aside for a short time. These are not it. Now, your organization may also be in the happy circumstance of having some kind of cash flow surplus. Wouldn't that be lovely? So what is it that you might do with that? Let's talk about this happy scenario. First, make sure that you are being mindful of any restrictions or deferred obligations. Like I said, a lot of organizations will look at that bottom line on their report and be like, oh, wow, we've got lots of money in the bank. And then not think like, yeah, but that's that 3-year grant that you got that's supposed to last you. That's not just cash that you can spend, or actually that's token money. That's not money you can just spend. Like whatever that, just make sure that you are very clear about your relationship to that money and your access to it. And then beyond that, if you do have a surplus, looking for opportunities to make sure that you have a really fiscally healthy organization. You can pay down debt. That'll help you reduce payments every month and interest. You can save to increase the reserves that you have and cover future fluctuations in your financials. You can invest in your organization in staffing or training, get more supplies, tools, infrastructure, that kind of thing. So just things to keep in mind should you be experiencing that fortunate situation. And then, like I said, I think we have some time to look at the spreadsheet itself, but does anyone have any questions while I pull that up? You guys are quiet today. Okay, let me see. Oh, that's Amanda's thing. That's not the spreadsheet.
Yeah, you're welcome to just come right off mute and ask your question, or if you need to be quiet where you are, you can just put it in the chat and we'll read it for you.
Okay, I've got this pulled up, so let me go ahead and share my screen again. This is the tool that I'm going to give all of you, so you'll get a copy of this, and I like to just kind of poke around it a little bit so that you can kind of see how it works. There are also some notes that I've added for all of you so that just to help with your use of the tool. Hopefully those notes will just kind of give you a reminder about some of the nuance. But what I really like is, like I said, should we change any information related to like our projections, for example, we'll see it change overall. So this grant right here, if we don't get that in December, we can see that this negative number comes up really fast, right? But if we put it back and say maybe this amount is not 3,000, it's 9,000, we can see these numbers. Oh, these are not wide enough. We can see these numbers jump up right away, right? So we can see the changes in, the changes that we're making to our projections immediately reflected in the next several months. And if we do the same down here, where we say, okay, say for this program, these are all the expenses, right? Say this expense was not so high, that kind of jumped right up, huh? We've got a big January expense, another big January expense. What if we can take this down and just say it's maybe $1,200, instead of 2,200? Now we can see that impacting right away, right? This changed. Let's watch it again. So 2,500 to 1,500, right? So we can see that change right away. Let's play with it a little more when we make changes down here. So say these were not all reconciled. We can, say these are things that we're playing with projections. And say we got this credit card paid off, and so we didn't have to pay all of these payments right here. Wouldn't that be lovely? Then we can see again, make sure all my columns are big enough to show the numbers. We can see how that changes things over several months, right? So rather than this ending in a negative number, we're able to get that paid off. All of these are now gone, and we can see what happens here. But let's say that all of these things that we went through and just like removed, say that the total of these things is 7,250, right? We see that down here. So let's remove it from here and put it just right here. We're going to add it to this 8,250. It's the same amount, so we still see this, but we see it happening differently, right? Now, instead of it gradually tapering down, it happens much more swiftly because we paid it all the way up here. So we can just kind of see how when we make different decisions, the impact of that changes, and the result of that impact is either more jarring or smoother, right? And so what we want to try to do in this cash flow projection is just have a really good awareness of what our financial health is, how the money is coming in and out of our organization. We want to be able to plan for any kind of big circumstance, to mitigate any big crisis. But we also want to try to keep it as flat and smooth as possible to help prevent that kind of those big catastrophic events. So being able to find ways to kind of mitigate those big concerns is really helpful. So for example, if we have this big payment that we have to make in January on program A, then if we come up here and we say, okay, what if what we did is start increasing our, expected donor amounts by doing some kind of fall appeal. So we know that in January we have this big expense. Maybe in October, November, December, we ramp up fundraising, and maybe we can make this $250, $500, and then maybe $1,000. What if we could earn just that much? Okay, that number went significantly smaller, right? Okay, maybe that's not quite enough. What should we do instead? Maybe we actually need to start that a little earlier and increase it, a little earlier, ramp it up a little higher, like this. Okay, now we can see, oh, it's at least a positive number now. So this kind of scenario planning can be really helpful to figure out how does making a few changes to the plan for your organization help to watch something several months out become less concerning and mitigate something that is not going to now just kind of like come up and hit you in the face. You can see it coming. You can make small incremental changes over time. Any questions while we're in the spreadsheet? If anyone wants to see something or try something, we can play with it a little bit. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But I'm curious, how is this landing? How is this resonating? Are you thinking that, are you doing anything like this currently? Are you thinking that you might take up on this cash flow projection? How is this resonating with you right now?
I can chat. Oh, go ahead, Dara.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say that the thing that I like is how the cash flow.
Oh, you went on mute. We caught how the cash flow.
Sorry, goes horizontally across your page because it allows for a larger number of fields to be viewable at once, where mine is going vertically down and I have to constantly scroll up and down to kind of see. So just the arrangement, the way you have it, otherwise mine's very similar, it just seems like it's got a better layout. So I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that you are already doing something related to this, because that, says a lot about your investment in your financial health. And hopefully this tool will make it a little more simple. Rachel, were you going to add something as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know I missed most of the workshop. I was like hopping in and out, so I'm really looking forward to watching the recording. But what I did see seemed very helpful. Cash flow has kind of always been like this mysterious black box for me. So it's good to see. I really like the spreadsheet that you shared on the template and like the examples to kind of break it down and see how it could be really feasible to develop.
Good. I'm glad that it's looking valuable for you guys as well.
Jan says in the chat that they use a similar spreadsheet. I was wondering if Jan wanted to talk about what they use and how it's different or what's similar. And if you're not able to
Let me
talk.
unmute, sorry. I have, we are a very small market. We actually only have, we only operate about 16 days or 16 weekends and only on Saturday mornings. And we're in a town of 7,000 people. so we are very small.
Which town, which market are you with, Jen?
Madras Saturday Market.
Okay.
So Central Oregon, sort of the stop between Portland and Bend. But we have our own categories, and we have them slightly different only because our major expenses, fall into insurance and liability and that sort of thing, market managers and music. But we do consolidate everything up to categories still, so that it's easier to take a small snapshot and be able to show, here's our projection in each of the categories, and here's what we've spent year to date in each of these categories, as well as what's predicted coming up with bills that we know we have coming. So again, it's similar. We just have slightly different categories, and ours is a little bit simpler because we only operate, during the summer.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad to see that you guys are all kind of on top of this and doing some of this work already. That definitely says a lot about your investment in the financial health of your markets. That's really encouraging.
Yeah, the one thing that we also have, which is I think similar to yours, is we also have a run rate. So here's how much we're bringing in, and here's how much is going out. And we have that as a snapshot for our board members so that they can see. For example, this week we brought in 500, but 700 went out. This isn't going to work. And we can dive into then what those expenses were and how we either choose to limit those expenses or what are the steps we're going to take in order to increase the revenue.
Right. And what is the context of that? Like, is that something that, okay for a month or two, but not okay in the long term? Or this month we had this thing that we knew was coming and was totally fine and planned for, and that's why you see it. That context is so important. And I think what happens a lot is that board members get reports and they just look at it and take it for face value and go, oh, okay, cool. This number is a positive number. I don't have to worry or do anything. That's not always the case. There's a story to your money, and when they're not getting that story or that context, then they're not making sound financial decisions, because they don't have enough information to make informed judgment, right?
I totally agree. And we actually operate our market a little bit different, in that we try and generate all the revenue that we need for the next year. And then we have all of our years reserved that we can spend down from, so that we don't ever catch ourselves in that position where we have a bill come due and we don't have the money in the account. So we don't have to worry so much about the, month to month, money in, money out. We worry more about, are we collecting sufficient revenue in order to meet the bills that are projected for the following year.
Mm-hmm.
So we're always working not paycheck to paycheck, so to speak, or month to month, but we operate year over year. So again, our picture is a little bit different, and the context for our board members is a little bit different. So as an example, this year we have all of the funds that we need for this year in the bank. Everything that we projected to spend, we have in the bank. The problem is what are we going to start the market with next year? And that's where you see the big context from our perspective.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm happy to take any other questions.
Oh.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm glad it was valuable. Amanda, I don't see anything else in the chat.
Yeah, I guess if or if you have finished the presentation and nobody has anything that they want to discuss, we can, it's always nice to end things a little bit early for people if we're ready.
Yeah, nothing else from me. Like I said, I'm gonna send Amanda the slide deck. She's got the recording. I'll make sure and get that Excel spreadsheet over as well so that you have that template for that projection. And then I'll also include a link to that red book that I mentioned that has the Oregon like roles and responsibilities for board members, that guide to nonprofit board service. Just as another resource that I think is really helpful. There's a PDF version of it, so I'll send the link.
Great, great. And then we have another workshop with you coming up in the fall too. And that one is more on fundraising, I believe. Yeah, right? And
That sounds about right to me. I'll have to look at my notes, but yeah, love looping around with you guys. And I will look forward to that.
Oh, great. Looks like Dara was hoping to get more information about the red book. So yeah, we'll get that out.
Excellent. Yeah, glad to.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. And thank you so much, Jen. This has been really valuable. I learned a lot as well. And yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.